The United States likes to think of itself as a young country. We're 250 years old today, but in musical terms, young barely begins to describe it. When classical music was filling halls across Europe, America was still figuring out what it was. Vienna, Leipzig, and London, they all had lots of music in churches, opera houses. Classical music was part of their identity, but across the Atlantic, it looked nothing like that. Well, there were musicians, of course. Families sang at home. Churches filled Sundays with hymns. Soldiers marched with fife and drums. Fiddlers played in taverns and at dances. But if you were dreaming of being a composer and writing symphonies, America was not the place you went. In 1800, if someone had asked which country would define the future of music, there's simply no way the United States would have even made the list. How did a country with no Bach, no Beethoven, no Mozart, and no conservatory tradition in the beginning end up being such a power player in musical culture? So I think the obvious answer is that it eventually just caught up. We built orchestras, we trained composers, we did import European expertise though, but that explanation does miss something important, I think, because if that were the whole story, America would just look like a late arriving version of Europe, but it doesn't. See, something else happened. It changed what music was for. To see that, you have to understand what it inherited from Europe. In Europe, music wasn't just art, it was part of the whole cultural infrastructure. Kings, princes, they employed composers. Churches trained musicians. Noble families competed for prestige through performance. Concert life was just part of the institutions. Music really flowed from the top down. The United States basically inherited none of that. Of course, we had no royal courts. We had very little in the way of patronage system. And our conservatories don't really even come into play until the late 1800s. The fact is that for most of the 19th century, America didn't challenge Europe. We borrowed from it. If you wanted serious music, you imported it. European orchestras toured American cities. European and Russian performers were treated like royalty. Even American orchestras often relied on European conductors. And American composers were judged by a very simple but very unfair standard. Does it sound like Europe? Well, that makes sense. Germany, Austria, France, Italy, European countries had spent centuries building the language of classical music. America was still new. It wasn't trying to invent a tradition. We were trying to join one. But then something subtle shifts. See, in 1892, Antonin Dvorak arrives in New York to direct the National Conservatory. The expectations were what you would think. Europe, another European is going to teach America how to compose. But Dvorak looks at what's already there and suggests something different. Don't copy Europe, he says. Listen to what you already have. Listen to your spirituals, your folk songs, music that lives outside institutions but that come from your land. It was a strange claim coming from a European composer, and it wasn't fully accurate in every detail, but it pointed towards something real. You see, a culture doesn't find its voice by permanently imitating another, but at the same time, something else was already happening, far from concert halls. It wasn't happening there, and it wasn't happening in conservatories or opera houses or other institutions. It was happening in churches and dance halls, on street corners, and neighborhoods where cultures collided every day. You had African rhythms and you had spirituals meeting European harmony, folk traditions, you had military bands, and you had hymns which were absorbing new phrasing and rhythm. And from that collision came ragtime and then blues and then jazz. And this is American music. None of it asked for permission. It didn't need to be sanctioned by royal courts or by aristocrats. People simply listened. They danced, they bought sheet music. Later they bought recordings that sound normal now. It wasn't. For most of musical history, institutions decided what survived, but in America, audiences started deciding instead. That shift is hard to overstate because it meant music could spread without approval. A song didn't need status to survive, it just needed listeners. And once that system exists, everything accelerates. Recorded sound changes the entire equation. For the first time, music doesn't vanish when it ends. It becomes something you can store, copy, and send. You can listen to it anytime you want. America was in exactly the right place for that shift. America had cities growing fast. It had mass immigration. It had industry, distribution, and a huge internal market. And then you get radio. When you have that, records start to spread. Hollywood begins synchronizing music with film. Later, television extends that reach again. And music stops being local. It becomes scalable, and everything speeds up. Jazz starts to cross back over the Atlantic to Europe. Broadway is becoming a global template. Hollywood changes how orchestras are used. Rock and roll explodes into youth culture. Even country develops an international audience. And then later, hip hop begins in a single neighborhood in New York, but becomes a global language. So even if you don't listen to American music, you're almost certainly hearing its influence. And meanwhile, classical music doesn't disappear. It evolves inside this new system. And American orchestras start to become first class. Cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Los Angeles, they all start to develop major symphonic identities. And universities and conservatories become global training centers. You get composers like Charles Ives, George Gershwin, Aaron Copland, and Leonard Bernstein. They don't reject Europe. They translate it into a new, fresh language, our own language. But here's the key distinction. America doesn't replace Europe in classical music. Vienna's still Vienna, London's still London, Leipzig's still Leipzig, but it changes the scale of everything around it. Because by the 20th century, music is no longer defined by a unified tradition. It now exists across recordings, broadcasts, films, concerts, even clubs and stadiums, and eventually digital platforms. So what's happening is the center of gravity is shifting. So I think the original question comes back, but with a different meaning now. How did a country with no Mozart become so influential in music? Not by producing better composers or trying to catch up to Europe, but by stepping out of that competition entirely. Instead of competing within Europe's system of courts, conservatories, and traditions, America built a system where music could move, where the audience was primary, where recordings became primary, and where accessibility mattered more than lineage. And that really changes what music is. Not a fixed tradition, but something that constantly moves. And that might be the most important shift of all, because the real legacy isn't a certain composer or genre. It's a question that keeps repeating itself. What comes next? And it's why, 250 years after independence, we are still living inside a musical world that was reshaped far more by systems, technology, and audiences than by any single nation or individual.